and see what crazy things we might do. All right.
That's, that's the marvelous thing about this experience is we have no idea what's going to happen, and it's all very dangerous
Yeah,
now.
exactly. Yes. So watch and find out. All right. To our formal introduction, welcome to Revolutions Reconsidered, a deeper dive into the American Revolution. So, this season, we're focusing on the podcast Worlds Turned Upside Down, which hopefully you are listening to. And we are unpacking some of the sources, stories, and contributions that make up the show. I am Dr. Lynn Price Robbins, and I'm joined today by Dr. James Ambuske, creator of Worlds Turned Upside Down. Hey, Jim, welcome.
Hello, Len. It's great to be back with you. I know, we've taken a few months off in part because we all overcommit to too many projects, and we're all writing about 600 million podcast series at this point. So it's nice to have a little material in the shed now that we can come back to you with and talk about some of the great work that we've all been doing over the past these many months.
Absolutely. And now we're going to come out every week, I think, every Wednesday. So that's pretty exciting through
Indeed.
episode 10, right? 11? Who knows? So you just have to follow us and find out,
The
right?
revolution never ends, so who knows where we'll end up at this point.
For the rest of our lives, we will be here on Wednesdays. So
Exactly.
make sure to check it in. But today we're talking about episode 7, which is called The Divide. And it explores the efforts to map British America in the wake of the Seven Years' War, including the Proclamation Line and the archives that reveal this story. So, in our last episode, and you may want to go back after this and listen to episode 6. And so you can then rewatch this and then you can go and listen to episode 7. So make sure you block off a few hours on your calendar.
Just keep listening and listening and just drive up our numbers, right?
Exactly.
And don't forget to
You
like and
can mute
subscribe.
it.
Yeah.
You can mute us. Just keep us on. Yes, like and subscribe. So at the let's see, the last episode we were in or ending the 7 Years' War, which we call here in the U.S. the French and Indian War,
Right.
and it finally ended. And we had the Treaty of Paris, which was February 10th, 1763.
Hmm.
Okay, so what was the outcome of this war? Essentially, France and Spain, lots of the land that they owned here in the North American colonies, that land went over to the British. So now the
Right.
British is standing there and they're holding all this new land and they're like, haha, laughing evilly. What are we going to do with this now? Right? So they have all this land, and guess what? This land is not empty. But
Right.
in fact, there are many indigenous communities living on this land that Britain now claims as their own.
Right.
So, Jim, what is going to happen with the relationships now between this British Empire and all of these different indigenous communities?
It's such a great question. I think it's worth sort of taking a step back and kind of catching our audience back up and where we are. As you said, February 10th, 1763, the war is over, and then the British are already thinking about how to administer North America, and how to transform North America in the wake of the war as it's winding down. And so, but by the terms of that treaty, the British, right, they get Quebec, they get East and West Florida, they get islands of Grenada in the Caribbean. They claim dominion over territories pretty much all the way to the Mississippi. But as you said, right, these are not empty spaces. So the British are thinking several things at this point. How are we going to take these new colonies that we've acquired? How can we meld them and create a coherent empire with the older colonies? But then a big part of the outbreak of that war was colonial interest in lands in the Ohio country and the tensions that creates with native peoples. And so the British are beginning to think, all right, one of the huge sources of conflict was desire for native lands, and you had individual settlers buying land from native peoples. You had colonial governments negotiating for land cessions from native peoples. And the British say this is an absolute mess. This cannot continue because it leads to enormous instability, given that the global war they just fought as a result of those problems. So what the British say then in the post-1763 treaty period is that, all right, in the Proclamation of 1763 later that year in October, the king says essentially, and I'm paraphrasing, from now on, the British imperial government will manage relations with native peoples. that the purchase by settlers is now forbidden, that colonial governments cannot negotiate with native peoples for land unless it's part of a negotiation with an imperial representative. We have to try to maintain some kind of order so that there is not this violence between settlers and indigenous peoples that there had been. But importantly, as a consequence of this proclamation in 1763, there is language that's later confirmed by the Treaty of Niagara in 1764, in which the British begin to imagine and think about Native peoples as what we could think about as sovereign states, as political entities that are capable of negotiating with other powers, that are capable of making their own internal decisions, and that they have some kind of geographic or territorial coherence.
Mm-hmm.
So the British are beginning to recognize, in a way that they had started to, but haven't really before, the sovereign rights of Native peoples, and those the proclamation in 1763, and then that Treaty of Niagara the following year, become foundational to Native policy, both in what is the older mainland colonies of North America, but really, post the American Revolution, those are central to the British government and later the Canadian government's relationships with Native peoples.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is great, and it leads into the next question, which this episode was very much focused on maps, right?
Yes.
But I think we all remember from our school days that maps are very important when it comes to history, right? This
Right.
is we're, the French, the Spanish, they're leaving. The British are taking up lands. Okay, so what does it look like now? What does the North American British colonies, what does this map look like? And it seems like with this episode, maps are extremely important because we're
Mm-hmm.
almost recreating the British Empire. And you mentioned the king, and it sounds like the British from, across the pond want to do the creating this new British Empire
Mm-hmm.
and tell the people living on the ground there it's not really, it's not your job. It's not your business
Right.
to create the map of this new empire. And then there's this board of trade that you mentioned as well in the episode. So how exactly are these maps going to be created,
Mm-hmm.
and how is the king going to control it? Because it just seems like the big, as we look forward,
Right.
another revolution might have to do with controlling things from across the pond, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a big part of the issue, right? And so as I was talking about, the British are trying to create this coherent empire. They have, a bunch of older colonies on the mainland. They've got a bunch of new ones. They've got a bunch of new islands, but they don't have a complete picture of it. And if you look back in the Seven Years' War, one of the frustrating things for military commanders is they didn't have good maps. They were,
Right.
they would send out advanced engineers, right, to map these different spaces so that they could conduct campaigns. James Cook, right, the famous James Cook,
Hmm.
is a ship captain in the Royal Navy during the Seven Years' War, and some of the surveys that he does, along with Samuel Holland, are instrumental in allowing James Wolfe to conquer Quebec in September of 1759. So the British are taking a step back in this period and saying, all right, we need to map this space in high resolution.
Hmm.
We need to have a greater sense of what these new colonies look like that we don't really know much about. But as importantly, we also need to have a greater sense of what our older colonies look like. And they're thinking kind of in three ways, right? The defense of British America, they need to have a coherent, high resolution picture of these different spaces because they very much believe that this is not the last war with France. The king and his ministers, particularly in 62, 63, 64, just think it's a matter of time before the French and their allies try something again. So they need to have a clear sense of North America from a military standpoint. They
Right.
also need it from an administrative standpoint. A lot of the ministers, like the Earl of Halifax, have long been displeased with the kind of lack of coherent administration, the lack of coordination between the colonies, and the lack of binding those colonies closer to the mother country. So, in the interest of creating let's call it an administrative imperial state,
Hmm.
let's map these spaces and figure out where everything is. But then also economically, um, if you're going to have an empire focused on trade, it's really important you know what the coastline looks like. So you
Yes.
see a lot of the maps in this period are dedicated towards, particularly in Nova Scotia and what we now know as Maine, sort of mapping this tortuous coast, right? So you
Mm-hmm.
know where the good harbors are, where the ports are, accurate navigational information as well. But then the fourth thing I think is we're talking about with this episode largely is if we are going to take control of Native relations, if we are going to exert this imperial administrative state's oversight of negotiating with Native peoples, it's then in our interest, we being the British, but also in Native peoples, to have a clear delineation between Indigenous America and British America,
Right.
so that the peoples who are living in the lands that the king now claims as his dominions
Mm-hmm.
have some certainty of their sovereignty, and also a kind of a border that the British army can then police, so that settlers are not streaming over that border
Mm-hmm.
and disrupting native lives and causing conflict that might then lead to that next war that they see coming down the pike. So they have a lot of things in mind here when they want to try to make, as my one of my mentors calls, the new map of empire.
Right, right. And it makes sense because it it's sort of organizing this new empire, and it benefits everybody
Right.
living there on the ground just
Right.
to know where they are and where the borders are. All of this makes perfect sense. And Worlds got to interview Dr. Max Edelson, who is a fantastic scholar and also just brilliant as far as maps go. And so we have a clip from him talking about his
Mm-hmm.
recent research and how he got into maps. But I'm gonna let you go ahead and introduce him, and then we'll listen to this bonus clip that you won't hear in the actual episode.
Yeah, so Dr. Edelson, he's the aforementioned author of a colleague who coined the term New Map of Empire, because that's the name of his book, which is, you should go buy it. It's from Harvard University Press. And it's a terrific book. But what the clip we have here is Max talking about sort of the origins of that project. One of the things we used to talk about when I was a graduate student is that he saw an opportunity to apply for a fellowship at the Library of Congress on cartography. He didn't know what his next project was going to be, so but he was just like, "What the hell? Let's go look at some maps." But when he got there, he realized that there are these maps from places like Nova Scotia or the Floridas that were raising from questions for him that he didn't have an answer to yet. And so the clip we'll hear is about that journey of discovery that then led to the project that ultimately became his book.
Fantastic. So I'm going to start this, and it also gives us, I think, a good insight into how historians sometimes come upon their topics and what becomes their life works,
Right.
really. All right, so here we
At
go.
the University of Virginia, I teach a bunch of courses on the history of cartography. It's one of the things I really enjoy doing here. But when I started this research, I guess in 2007 or 2008, years ago, I had never taken a course on the history of cartography. I had worked with historic maps a bit, but I got a fellowship for the year for my sabbatical to work at the Library of Congress, which has the biggest map collection in the world. And I had some ideas. I had some map makers I knew from my previous research that I wanted to start with. But I just wanted to investigate British mapping in the 18th century and get to know it and see if I could build a research project on top of it. And when I started looking at the Library of Congress's enormous collection of manuscript maps that the British produced during this period, what I was expecting to find were tons of maps of the places I knew well: South Carolina, Massachusetts, New York, Virginia, the big colonies with the most people. I expected that they would also have the most maps. But what I found was that places I didn't know very well, places like Pensacola and Grenada and Nova Scotia, those were the places that were exhaustively mapped. And I wanted to find an explanation to this. Why were all of these maps of remote frontier places in the 1760s and 1770s, why were they so represented in the collections of the Library of Congress? So this project and this moment in imperial history emerged from this study of the map archive. And although I found many maps at the Library of Congress, the real mother lode for these maps is the UK National Archives in Richmond, England. The maps I looked at there were remarkable. And in fact, we talked a little bit about the negotiation of the boundary line. As surveyors are putting together maps of the course of the boundary line, What they do is they take these huge sheets of drafting paper and they paste them together until they become giant rolls. And there are these tables at the National Archives where I brought out these huge rolls and unspooled them. And some of them were probably 50 feet long. And so they provided this super high resolution picture of the actual survey data that was used to negotiate these lines.
So honestly, I think my first reaction to that is, how did all of these go, I guess, hidden for so long?
Yeah.
All of these amazing maps. Do you know anything about the collection, or why, no early US historian has looked at these maps before? Or do you think it was just one of those things, just kind of, you
I,
know?
I think, so there have been map historians that have looked at them before, but
Uh-huh.
I think what it is that maps are very difficult to work. They're pleasing to look at, right? You're like, oh, this is a great map of South Carolina or Nova Scotia, and like the famous Fry Jefferson map of
Oh yeah.
Virginia, right?
Hmm.
That surveyed by Peter Jefferson, Thomas Jefferson's father, in the 1750s, and has that wonderful cartouche
Oh
that
yes.
very clearly shows how deeply wedded Virginia is to slavery and the transatlantic slave trade and tobacco. But as an object of study, they can be overwhelming, right? Because
Yeah.
often what you're seeing with the maps that the reproductions we might hang on our wall are simply the final product of a long process of surveying. So I think what
Right.
Max was getting at there with those long sheets, right, is teams of surveyors going out to these far-flung places, making the initial survey maps, and then using those to reconstruct and create that high-resolution map. So they can be in ways that I think are different than letters, right, when we're
Hmm.
writing histories, right? Letters, we read through them. You know this way better than I do as a documentary editor. You're
Hmm.
reading through these letters. You begin to stitch together the argument based on what you're reading. But
Right.
maps have all of these visual elements, and they are a product of a history in their own right that you have to reconstruct that object before you can then begin to reconstruct the purpose that um, led to their creation. So, I've not. I will say one story, right? So I was just ridiculous, stupid luck, right? I got a fellowship in 2015 to go to Windsor Castle to look in the Royal
Oh.
Archives there as part of the Georgian Papers program and
Uh-huh.
look through George III's papers.
Oh
And
wow.
there was, so you've got the Royal Archives, right?
Hmm.
That's separate. And then you've got the print room, which is a separate thing.
Hmm.
And then you've got the Royal Library.
Okay.
Um, and one day I got invited to go to the Royal Library because I wanted to look at a text. Incidentally, I was reading that text in front of the very fireplace that Queen Elizabeth I used to sit and read in front of.
Oh, come on, Jim.
I
Making
know,
us jealous.
I know. Episode 7, Jim brags a lot. But when I was in the print room, I got to see some of the King's topographical map collection, which is George III's maps, because he was
Oh my
very
gosh.
interested in seeing what this empire looked like. He was a
Right.
huge map enthusiast. So I've seen a little bit of that, and of course when I used to work at Mount Vernon, a wonderful collection
Hmm.
gifted to the library there by Richard H. Brown, part of a wonderful project called Argo. So argomaps.org. Check that out there. Um, but the extent to which, of course, Max was working with these, um, I remember as a young student sitting in his office looking at all the organization of his files and how he had like cabinets files filled with different information about different maps and how I'm like, how are you going to do this?
Right.
And he put together a great book that certainly shapes the way that I think about this history, and I think other people as well.
Not only that, but I think it really helps to understand how to read maps, or
Yes.
if just maps give us a lot more
Yeah.
information than we usually give them credit for.
Right. Right.
Um,
And maps are objects of power. They are showing you
right.
geographic information that you want to know, and they're showing you information that the creators want you to see, and that's really important.
Oh, I think that that's a fantastic point. And since we're talking about, power and borders, let's talk about this proclamation line.
Yes.
One of the first things I thought of when you were, talking about in the episode is the Mason-Dixon line,
Uh
simply
huh.
because I live on one side of it, and I grew up on the other side of it,
Right.
and I think of it as like this line. I mean, it's not a line. It's just like when you
Yeah.
get to the border of Virginia, you don't have to step over a line to get to North Carolina.
Right.
And so this proclamation line technically is well, I'll let you explain what exactly
Yeah.
this line is, but also why it's not as straightforward as we tend to see it. You're like, oh, it's a line, right? Why
Right.
it's not as straightforward, and you talk about that in the episode, but also why that
Hmm.
matters. So why the fact that this line, this nebulous little space on a map, why it's so important, and why it matters.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
It's the proclamation line is fun. Uh, and it's like something we all learn in school. Like you look at a
Mm-hmm.
textbook, and it's like the textbook is the part you get to on the American Revolution, and they say there's this line that the British established that say colonists you cannot go past, and that angered a lot of colonists, and that was one of the factors of the revolution. And you
Mm-hmm.
look on what they've got in the textbook, and there's a clear line that they've got drawn roughly along the Piedmont or along the Appalachian Mountains from, say, Georgia on north. Um, and the Royal Proclamation of 1763 essentially says, okay, if we're going to exert control over Native American diplomatic relations, we're also going to create clear boundaries
Air quotes, yes.
between British America and Indigenous America,
Mm-hmm.
and we take it for granted that the image we see in those textbooks is a complete line, a real line that was there, that is reflective of reality, and that sprang forth from the Proclamation of 1763 complete.
Right.
That's all just total crap. Uh, now, not to diminish textbook publishers or demean textbook publishers, because it's convenient, right? You don't have time to walk an eighth grade student through the process by which this line was
Right.
created.
It's too
But
complicated.
right, too complicated. Also, the name of your other show, too complicated for history. But it is reflective of the fact that this line had to be created. And it
Mm-hmm.
was not simply the British imposing their will, it was a process of negotiation with native peoples. And
Right.
so I think, if I remember rightly, something like 9 or 10 what they call congresses. So,
Mm-hmm.
Congress in the 18th century before 1775 just means a meeting. Um, British diplomats and native leaders will get together at different places, and they will talk about where this line is going to go. And it's not simply, right, the British who have an interest in where this line goes. The native peoples like the Cherokee or the Haudenosaunee have a very critical interest in shaping the course of this line.
Mm-hmm.
So what we see then from 1763, when the line is more or less done in 1774, when it all goes to hell, is a process of both surveying and identifying that line, but also changing that line because it will shift and erode over the course of this period.
Because we're talking about a line, it's going over mountains, it's going over rivers.
Right.
It's not like I-95, which
Right.
you can follow. It's created, and it's nebulous, but it's very, very important, ideally, to respect in
Yeah,
order to keep
exactly.
good relations.
Well, and I like the analogy of the highway, right? So, I-95, for those of you on the West Coast, I-95 runs up basically from Florida to, all the way up the East Coast.
Right.
It's scary to be on, so
Yes, it
just
is.
avoid certain segments of it. Or like where I'm from, Ohio. I-70 runs from Pennsylvania through
Mm-hmm.
Ohio all the way to Colorado. It's like that's a line you can see. You can
Right.
clearly see that I'm on this side of the line and you're on that side of the line. And what they're trying to do with the proclamation line is figure out, okay, we're going to have a boundary. Which mountain peaks does this go over?
Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's one of the things that misconceptions is it looks like that line goes over all those mountains, and no, but they're out there sort of figuring out, all right, this mountain peak, this river, this this forest, this piece of property.
Mm-hmm.
How are we're going to adjust it, and then we're going to meet at these congresses. We're going to look at these maps that we've drawn, and we're going to agree to it. And once we've done that, we're going to go out and put blazes, essentially marking the line, so that there is some sense of, or the appearance of,
Yes.
political control over these spaces.
Right.
But as you wonderfully pointed out, political borders are imaginary,
Mm-hmm.
and you can walk through them um, with easier regularity than you, in the 18th century than you could today, certainly, right? But
Absolutely.
imagine, the United States, we can cross Virginia or Connecticut's border with ease.
Yeah.
The European Union, you can go from France to Italy on a train ride and no problem.
Mm-hmm.
That's the kind of situation here. There's still a lot of movement back and forth. The British and Native peoples are trying to figure out precisely where this is all going to be because they're trying to ensure some kind of stability.
Right. And I think one of the really interesting things about this is you're talking about surveyors. And yes, surveying is very interesting, and we're not going to try to get into that. But it wasn't just these British surveyors, but they
Right.
had to work with the indigenous population as well, because let's be honest, everyone wanted to have an eye on it to make sure it was fair
Right.
and it was done correctly. So, can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, really, it's diplomacy,
Right.
I would think, because everyone has to agree on it to a certain extent so as to
Yeah.
not create yet another, I don't want to say war, but to keep things diplomatically peaceful.
Yeah, and what we have to keep in mind too is that, as I said earlier, Native peoples have their own interest in this, right?
Right.
And the Cherokee and the Haudenosaunee are two prime examples of how they are using their power and influence to shape this line to their own advantage. So, a concrete example is in 1768 at the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. The That's being overseen on the British side by a guy named Sir William Johnson, who's the superintendent of Indian Affairs for the Northern District, and then the Haudenosaunee representatives. And so these meetings are being conducted according to native protocols, and with speeches and time for reflection. But they're also looking at maps. And we know that William Johnson's instructions from London were to terminate the border between the native nations and the Ohio country, over which the Haudenosaunee claim authority, terminate that boundary between those nations and the colony of Virginia at the junction of the Ohio and Kanawha rivers. So, where West Virginia is now.
Right.
The Haudenosaunee are extremely worried that settlement will, the Haudenosaunee are in northern New York, but they claim the Ohio country. And so they are thinking about what are the best ways that we can preserve our sovereignty? What are the best ways that we can preserve our authority and our territorial integrity?
Right.
So at this meeting, Johnson, who has this instructions to say, all right, we're going to put the border at the Kanawha and the Ohio, Johnson essentially disobeys those instructions and says, what if we move the border and let it run the length of the Ohio River?
Right.
And the Haudenosaunee are like, all right, this actually makes a lot of sense to us. Because if we deflect settlement into those spaces, into the Ohio country, then it's less likely that settlers will move into the spaces that we care about the most in northern New York.
Sure.
So they are trying to deflect settlement away from their homelands. The Cherokee will do the same thing in 1770 at the Treaty of Lochabar in South Carolina, which is another adjustment between them and the colony of Virginia. They will cede land strategically so that they can deflect settlement away from their homelands. But what it does, right, is it's vectoring settlement into the Ohio country, into lands controlled by the Shawnee or the Delawares and the Miami, so that they,
Right.
as Max, Dr. Edelson says in our episode, they in turn bear the brunt of at least this initial wave of colonization. So you have a lot of strategic thinking on both sides about how this line can work to mutual advantage in ways that create a stable North America, but also from the indigenous side, at least for some peoples, allow them to defend their sovereignty and the control of the spaces that they care the most about.
Right. And I think one thing that you're talking about in here that I think it's important to mention in every
Right,
episode is that at least we were taught, I was taught
right,
early on, you see these indigenous populations as one big,
right,
unit. And
right,
I think in every episode of Worlds, there's something that happens that reminds us, no, they're
yeah,
very distinct. And in perhaps, you know, negotiating for their best interest, they may be, harming the best interest of another, um, indigenous community.
Right, right,
And so there's a lot going on here. It's not just between Britain and, indigenous communities, but it's many indigenous communities, with the British and with each other, which I think is very
right,
interesting.
right. They all, and that's what makes the job so difficult for the British, right? Is they realize that, and they have begun to realize by the 1760s, the people who are really paying attention, that you have to negotiate with these various groups of people on their own terms.
Right.
But then thinking about the Haudenosaunee, the British are very willing to acknowledge that the Haudenosaunee control the Ohio country because it's politically convenient then to negotiate these deals without having to deal with the Delawares, the Miamis, or people
Right.
like that. So that native assertion of sovereignty and power and authority can work to the British advantage as well.
So I'm sure in episode 8, we're going to move forward and learn more absolutely fascinating topics and facts about the coming of the American Revolution. But I wanted to end our first live broadcast on a really easy question for you, Jim.
Great. That doesn't sound ominous.
You know
or
how I
anything.
like my easy
Yes.
questions. But this is something that I think about a lot, and I think
Yeah.
a lot of historians think about a lot, particularly when thinking about people who maybe don't understand why we can be so passionate about topics that they feel have already been covered.
Right,
It's
right.
like we know everything we need to know. Do something else, do something more useful with your time. But so early on, when we're talking about the Proclamation Line, and we talk about how it's a very complicated story, so it's very simple in our textbooks. And then Dr. Edelson, he finds all these maps and he says, I'm going to take the time to really go through them. And what he does essentially with his work is he doesn't create necessarily a whole new narrative, but he certainly complicates
Right.
a narrative. So, in a way, he's changing and improving our knowledge of history. And so, in this way, I think this is a really good example of how history's never done. How,
Right. Yeah.
you can say what happened here, and it seems simple to say this is what happened, the end, but it's never really done. And I think that your episode is such a good example of that. So, so what do you think on this? Yeah.
Yes, I agree. But it is a hard question. Um, I mean, I guess if we can think about the stories we tell or the history we tell and the kind of, let's call it a grand narrative. That's not precisely it, but let's borrow from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Let's call it the sacred timeline, right?
Okay.
Or maybe more apt, like let's think about it as a kind of slow moving river, where that river represents the accumulation of knowledge we have about a particular topic, and we feel like we're in a stable place. But then every once in a while, either somebody asks a new question or somebody discovers new evidence. And then, like a flood, right, a flash flood, that river turns into a raging river and then starts generating new activity, new questions, new excitement about the past. And, like a flood, can alter that river's course.
Right.
It may not necessarily change the kind of fundamental facts about what happened, but really ours is a discipline of explaining why things happened.
Right.
And so every once in a while the dam's going to burst, and we'll have a fundamental rethinking about why things happen the way they did. And I think that's the case here with the Proclamation Line. A lot of historians, or I wouldn't say a lot, but a lot of early Americanists would know that the line was a product of negotiation, but that is not in the kind of, I don't know, cultural zeitgeist of
Right.
our memory of the American Revolution. It's a thing that was instantaneously created. It angered settlers, and then kablooey. But that's
Right.
not really the case. Like this is, if to use my analogy, right, with the revolution is the march toward the revolution is also kind of a river. But then every once in a while, something will accelerate that.
Yes.
And that's where we're going to go in these upcoming episodes, because the British are figuring out life in this period. The indigenous people are figuring out life. Settlers are figuring out life. But things are going to take interesting turns.
Yes, turns, and we might have some rapids, might have a few boats overturning, but
We might have a stamp act.
ooh, yes, we have stamp acts, some acts that are simply intolerable. We don't know.
Exactly.
We'll have to see. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share, Jim, before we sign off on our first live endeavor?
No, this is great. We decided to go live, and I prefer this format. So, one of the things I think we want to do in the future is maybe take questions from the audience. If they're watching, would love to do that, because you never know what's going to happen. Like, you hit that live button, and I kind of like to think about it. Like what Grant allegedly wrote to. Well, you would know this because you're an editor at the Lincoln Papers. Is it true that Grant writes or says something to the effect of, after the Battle of Wilderness, like, if you see the president, tell him from me there's no turning back. That's kind of like what I feel about live stream conversations. Like, you hit that live button, there's no turning back.
There's no turning back, so you never know what's going to happen, right? Well, we should at least plug our respective works and these thousands of podcasts and things we've been working on.
Indeed.
So I'll just mention, I did mention Too Complicated, a little tongue-in-cheek, because I'm a co-host of Too Complicated for History, a history podcast. And we also have a Patreon, which is under Primary Source Media. So if you're interested, now you can just sign up for free, or if you're interested in assisting us to do projects and, like this here, like our Too Complicated for History, we'd love that as well. And we are on all of your social media, Instagram, TikTok. So just look up Too Complicated for History. We also do historical birthdays today. It's always fun to know who you share a birthday with. Hopefully someone good, right? We don't always have the
There's a
best.
few birthdays in April that are not worth
You're
sharing.
like, maybe I don't want to share this one. Right. Yeah. So that's all of ours. And how about you, Jim? What should people go to see you?
Yeah, check out Worlds Turned Upside Down on all your major podcast apps. I co-head R2 Studios, which is at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for History and New Media at George Mason University, which is like the longest title on earth. So check out all of our shows at r2studios.org. That's R2, like the robot from Star Wars, so r2studios.org. And we would love your support as well, both your listens and, if you're so inclined, your financial support to help us make the best history podcast possible.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Jim. Looking forward to next week at this time.
Yes.
2:30 Eastern time. We will be live again on this YouTube channel, and we'll be talking about the very next episode of Worlds Turned Upside Down.
Yes, it's called The Trade, and we're going to blow your minds with how the transatlantic trade works. And we were going to show you how insurance can actually be interesting.
Oh, that I'm interested in, because you may have to do some convincing for some of your listeners on that one. Well, thank you so much, and I'm going to attempt to end this excellent podcast and thank everyone for watching.
Thanks
you. Thanks again, Jim.
Thank you, Lynn.
I don't know how to turn it off.
That's part of the magic of movie making.
Okay, we're off.